Have you ever stared at your phone, fighting the urge to text him, and wondering if your silence even matters, if he notices, if he cares, or if you're slowly disappearing from his mind? Here's the truth most people won't tell you. Silence is not empty. Silence speaks. And in a man's mind, it can be louder than words. When you stop reaching out, something unexpected happens. His sense of certainty cracks. The comfort of knowing you're always there starts to fade. And in that space, between what he had and what he might be losing, his mind begins to wander back to you. Not because you chased, not because you explained, but because you didn't. Silence disrupts patterns, and the human brain hates disruption, especially when it comes from someone who mattered emotionally. When you pull back, you force him to confront questions he never had to ask before. Why isn't she texting? Did I mess up? Is she moving on? This is where attraction often shifts, not through effort, but through absence. But let me be clear, this isn't about playing games or manipulating emotions. It's about understanding psychological space, emotional balance, and self-respect. Silence only works when it comes from strength, not fear. In this video, we're going to break down why silence feels so powerful, what actually happens in a man's mind when you don't reach out, and how to use distance in a healthy, grounded way without losing yourself in the process. So before you send that text, watch this. When no contact begins, a man's emotional reaction usually doesn't look dramatic on the outside. There's no instant panic, no emotional confession. In fact, at first, it can seem like nothing is happening at all. But internally, that's rarely true. The first thing he feels is a break in rhythm. Men get emotionally comfortable with consistency, even when they don't consciously value it. Your presence becomes part of his emotional environment. When that suddenly disappears, his mind notices the absence before his heart does. Something feels off, even if he can't explain why. Then comes curiosity. He starts checking his phone more often, not because he expects a message, but because part of him still assumes you'll reach out. When you don't, his certainty begins to erode, and uncertainty is uncomfortable. It creates mental noise. Questions creep in. Why hasn't she texted? Did something change? Is she pulling away? As time passes, curiosity often turns into self-reflection. This is where the emotional shift deepens. Without constant communication, he no longer gets emotional reassurance from you, and that forces him to sit with his own feelings, something many men aren't used to doing in real time. He may start replaying moments, conversations, or small things he took for granted. For men with emotional depth, this phase often leads to awareness. He begins to recognize your value not through your availability, but through your absence. For emotionally avoidant men, the reaction can be different: detachment, distraction, or surface-level busyness. But even then, the silence lingers in the background. No contact doesn't create emotions from nothing. It reveals what was already there, and how he reacts emotionally tells you far more about him than any text ever could. When you stop reaching out, his thoughts don't disappear. They actually get louder. And the reason isn't mystery or magic, it's psychology. The human mind is wired to focus on what's missing. When something familiar suddenly vanishes, the brain tries to restore balance. You weren't just a person he talked to. You were part of his mental routine. Your messages, your presence, the emotional access you provided all became predictable, and predictability creates comfort. So when that comfort is gone, his mind fills in the silence with you. He starts thinking about moments instead of messages, the way you laughed, the way you reacted to certain things. Small details that didn't stand out before suddenly feel sharper. This happens because the brain assigns more value to what's no longer immediately available. Absence strips away distraction and leaves memory behind. Another reason he thinks about you more is unfinished emotional loops. Conversations left open, feelings never fully expressed. When you stop reaching out, those loops don't get closure. They stay active. And active loops demand attention. His mind revisits you not out of desperation, but out of unresolved emotional energy. There's also an identity shift happening. When you were always present, he didn't have to question his place in your life. Now he does. And that uncertainty nudges his ego and emotional security. He starts wondering where he stands, whether he still matters, whether someone else has stepped into the space he assumed was his. This isn't about manipulation or strategy. It's about contrast. When you're always there, you blend into the background of his life. When you're gone, you stand out. Silence doesn't force thoughts. It creates space for them. And in that space, his mind often returns to the one person who's no longer reaching out. You. Silence doesn't just change how he thinks. It changes how he feels. And the shift is subtle at first, almost invisible. But over time, it can completely reshape the emotional dynamic between you. When you were always available, the emotional weight of the connection leaned toward you. You carried the effort, the emotional maintenance, the checking in. Silence removes that imbalance. It forces him to emotionally recalibrate because the reassurance he once received effortlessly is no longer there. What happens next is an internal shift from certainty to awareness. Certainty is passive. It doesn't require reflection. Awareness does. When silence enters the picture, he becomes more conscious of the connection itself. Not just that it exists, but what it means and what it costs to lose. Emotionally, this often creates tension. Not anxiety in the dramatic sense, but a low-level emotional pull. He feels the gap where your presence used to be. And that gap invites emotion to surface. Sometimes nostalgia, sometimes longing, sometimes regret. Silence gives those feelings room to breathe. Another powerful shift happens in value perception. When someone is constantly accessible, their emotional presence can be taken for granted. Silence reintroduces contrast. Suddenly, your time, energy, and attention feel finite instead of guaranteed. And human beings instinctively value what isn't unlimited. This is also where emotional roles begin to reverse. Instead of you wondering where you stand, he starts to feel the uncertainty. Instead of you seeking clarity, he starts questioning the dynamic. Silence doesn't punish. It redistributes emotional responsibility. But here's the key. This shift only happens when silence is rooted in self-respect, not resentment. When you step back calmly, without explanation or emotional charge, you signal emotional strength. And emotional strength is what creates attraction, respect, and genuine curiosity. Silence doesn't create emotion. It reveals and reorganizes it. No contact can be powerful, but only when it's done with clarity. And one of the biggest mistakes women make is using silence while still emotionally chasing. On the outside, you're not texting. But on the inside, you're watching his stories, rereading old messages, and waiting for signs. That kind of silence isn't calm. It's tense. And tension leaks, even when words don't. Another common mistake is breaking no contact too early out of discomfort. Silence can feel unbearable when you're used to connection. The urge to just check in often comes from anxiety, not intuition. And when you reach out too soon, you reset the dynamic back to where it was. Him comfortable, you uncertain. Many women also make the mistake of using no contact as a test, waiting to see if he texts, measuring how long it takes, interpreting silence as proof of worth. This turns no contact into emotional self-punishment instead of self-protection. Silence is not a scoreboard. It's a boundary. Another trap is over-explaining before going silent, sending long messages about needing space, listing feelings, or hoping he'll finally understand. In reality, explanations often dilute the power of silence. Emotional clarity doesn't come from speeches. It comes from contrast. And finally, there's the mistake of staying silent without growth. No contact isn't about freezing your life while you wait. If nothing changes internally, your standards, your emotional habits, your self-trust, then silence becomes hollow. When contact resumes, the same patterns will return. No contact works best when it's not a tactic, but a reset. It's choosing peace over proving a point, clarity over control, and confidence over constant reassurance. When silence comes from self-respect, it stops being a mistake and starts becoming a turning point. Silence doesn't just work on a conscious level. It goes deeper. It slips past logic and settles into the subconscious, where emotional instincts live. This is where the real shift begins. On a subconscious level, silence disrupts emotional safety patterns. When you were consistently present, his nervous system learned to relax around that predictability. Your availability became a quiet reassurance. When it's suddenly gone, his subconscious registers change before his mind can rationalize it. Something feels unsettled, even if he can't name it. One of the first things silence triggers is loss awareness. Not loss in the dramatic sense, but the possibility of it. The subconscious doesn't wait for confirmation. It reacts to threat, and emotional distance is perceived as a threat to connection. This is why thoughts of you surface randomly, without intention. The mind is trying to re-anchor what feels uncertain. Silence also activates self-evaluation. Without your emotional presence reinforcing his sense of desirability or importance, his subconscious starts scanning inward. Did I do enough? Did I misjudge her feelings? Did I assume too much? These questions aren't always conscious, but they influence his emotional state and behavior. Another powerful trigger is role reversal. When you stop reaching out, the emotional spotlight shifts. Instead of being the one receiving effort, he becomes the one aware of its absence. His subconscious begins to associate your silence with independence and strength, qualities that naturally command respect. For some men, especially those who avoid emotional vulnerability, this can create discomfort. They may distract themselves or suppress the feeling. But suppression doesn't erase impact. It delays it. Silence bypasses debate and explanation. It doesn't argue or convince. It simply exists. And in that quiet space, his subconscious begins rewriting the emotional meaning of the connection, often giving it more weight than ever before. No contact is often talked about like a guaranteed solution, but the truth is, it doesn't always work. And understanding when no contact backfires is just as important as knowing when it helps. Silence backfires when it's used to avoid reality instead of facing it. If a man has already emotionally checked out, no contact won't reignite interest. It may simply confirm his decision. In these cases, silence doesn't create longing. It creates distance that was already there. It can also backfire with men who struggle to read emotional cues. Some men don't interpret silence as space. They interpret it as closure. Especially if communication was inconsistent or unclear before, your absence might register as she's done. And instead of leaning in, he lets go. Another situation where no contact fails is when it's fueled by resentment or punishment. Silence charged with anger has a different emotional tone. Even without words, energy carries. If your withdrawal is meant to provoke guilt or force a reaction, it often creates defensiveness rather than reflection. No contact can also backfire when it's paired with emotional inconsistency. Disappearing, then reappearing, then pulling away again. This confuses rather than attracts. Emotional stability builds trust. Unpredictability erodes it. And perhaps the most overlooked reason it backfires is when nothing changes internally. If no contact is just waiting in stillness, hoping he'll return, without you growing, healing, or redefining your standards, the dynamic remains the same. When contact resumes, the same patterns follow. Silence is not a spell. It's a mirror. It reflects what already exists between two people. When there's emotional depth, silence can bring clarity. When there isn't, it brings closure. And sometimes, no contact backfiring isn't a failure. It's a redirection towards something healthier, more aligned, and more real. Attraction doesn't always grow through closeness. Sometimes it grows in the space where closeness used to be. Absence creates contrast, and contrast is one of the strongest forces behind emotional and romantic attraction. When you're constantly available, attraction can flatten into familiarity. Familiarity isn't bad, but it's comfortable, and comfort doesn't always spark desire. Absence disrupts that comfort. It removes the predictability that allows attraction to coast on autopilot. In absence, your presence becomes mentally active instead of physically accessible. He doesn't experience you through messages or conversations. He experiences you through memory and imagination. And imagination is powerful. The mind fills in the gaps, often idealizing what's missing more than what's present. Another reason attraction grows is emotional recalibration. Without constant interaction, he's forced to feel the emotional impact of the connection instead of being distracted by it. He notices what's different, what's quieter, what feels less full, and that emotional contrast brings awareness. Absence also restores polarity. When you stop over-giving, over-explaining, or over-pursuing, the emotional balance shifts. You return to your own center. That self-containment is attractive because it signals confidence and emotional independence. You're no longer chasing the connection. You're choosing yourself. But attraction only grows when absence is authentic. If silence is filled with anxiety, resentment, or waiting, the energy changes. True absence isn't about withdrawal. It's about presence with yourself. When attraction grows in absence, it's not because you disappeared. It's because you stopped trying to prove your value. You allowed space for longing, curiosity, and respect to naturally re-emerge. Absence doesn't create attraction from nothing. It amplifies what was already possible by giving it room to breathe. The hardest part of not reaching out isn't the silence. It's staying steady inside it. Confidence during no contact isn't about pretending you don't care. It's about learning how to care without abandoning yourself. Real confidence starts by shifting your focus from his reactions to your own